Another major theme in Matthew's gospel is the theme of forgiveness. That runs two different ways. It runs from a divine to human, so God forgiving people. But more than that, even, Matthew emphasizes the need for people to forgive other people, particularly people who claim to be following Jesus, to be agents of forgiveness. Some of his major parables deal with this idea. In Matthew 18, which is another one of those great collections of teachings in Matthew's gospel, we find some teaching here and then a follow up conversation with one of the disciples. In Matthew 18, starting in verse 15, Jesus says this: if your brother, and he uses masculine language just because that was the way people talked back then. So if another person sins against you, they do you wrong, go and tell them their fault privately between you and them alone. But if they do not listen, take along one or two others with you, that everything being established may be established by the evidence of two or three witnesses. If they refuse to listen even to these, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, let them be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Truly I say to you that whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again I say to you, if the two of you agree on anything, and they ask, it will be done before them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. That last part of that is widely quoted in a lot of Christian circles. But do you notice here specifically it is connected to a context that is about interpersonal forgiveness, about making things right between me and somebody else. If there's something that somebody else has done, Jesus is not somebody who says you just stick your head in the sand or pretend that it's okay or pretend it didn't happen. He actually recommends a confrontation. You go to them personally and you say how you feel. You say what's going on. And if they listen to you, you have won them. And forgive, and you let it go. It doesn't mean that you act like it never happened or that you pretend something's not true or that it didn't hurt. Nothing like that is what forgiveness means. What forgiveness does mean, though, is finding a way to move forward together. Jesus says here that if you've gone to that person individually and you've talked to them and that didn't work, and they're still doing whatever is hateful and hurtful and destructive, and this is somebody who shares Christian faith with you, pull in one or two others and have another private, quiet meeting with them so that maybe they can say, hey, you're wrong, or you're wrong. Sometimes other people have greater perspective on an entire situation than we do, and Jesus recommends a very small group that's connected to both people, trying to help them work it out. If their issue continues to be contentious, bring it up in the community of faith. And if they won't even listen to the general wisdom of the faith community locally, let them be to you like a Gentile and a tax collector. Does that mean you're just like, screw you, you didn't listen to the church, you're gone? The Gentiles and the tax collectors are special objects of God's love. People that are to be prayed for, to be witnessed to be demonstrated love to, even though we can't be in full fellowship with them until they change their heart. That's a pretty challenging teaching, and there'll be some resources up here on forgiveness. If we just even go into the secular, world of research, we know very clearly that harboring unforgiveness, holding on to something, holding a grudge, having something that just remains there, a serious wound that we don't deal with, it's bad for us. It can raise our blood pressure, it shortens our lifespan, it creates emotional distress, it can contribute to deep underlying problems that we have in our life, whether those are physical or psychiatric problems, and it generally lessens our quality of life. Forgiveness really, truly matters, and not because it's a way of sweeping things away. Forgiveness is never that. Not even forgiveness from God in Matthew's Gospel, as we'll look at in the parables of the judgment, is sweeping it away like it never happened. It's finding a way to move forward, hopefully together. It's finding a way to be free from whatever happened, and forgiveness is an alternative power. Instead of having to do to somebody else like they did to us, or write them off like they don't exist or they don't matter, the power to forgive another person is an alternative power that God gives to help us in our lives. Peter, who often is one of Jesus' disciples, and is very much the most outspoken, kind of the leader of the group, and the one who most frequently suffers from foot and mouth disease, saying things that we would all kind of like to say and then immediately regret saying them, comes to him after this and said, "Lord, how often should I forgive my brother who sins against me? 7 times?" Peter's being remarkably generous. In rabbinic tradition that the Pharisees, would have, believed in, they would have said you had to forgive somebody for an offense 3 times. And if they did it again after 3 times, you didn't ever have to forgive them or deal with them ever again. Jesus says, "I say to you, not 7 times, Peter, but 70 times 7. Who would remember by the time it's the 490th? So he's saying you continue to extend that forgiveness, that's your posture toward that person. And he tells a remarkable parable. He says, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. So this king has some servants that owe him money, that have been utilizing his money on his behalf. They owe him. They're debtors in that sense. As he began to settle with them, one was brought in who owed him 10,000 talents. That's a phenomenal amount of money. Literally, you could work for hundreds of thousands of years, and if you made an average daily worker's wage of 1 denarius a day, never ever pay it off. 10,000 or a myriad is like the largest single unit in Koine Greek. So Jesus shoots the moon. This is the largest unit of money you could ever owe. And the entire budget of Roman Judea was just like 4 talents a year during a really good year. This man owes 10,000. It is a ridiculous, a ludicrous amount of money. Trillions of dollars, in today's value system. And of course, he can't repay the debt. So the king decides he's going to have the man, his wife, his children, sold into slavery, which he had the legal right to do because the man couldn't pay the debt. He's like, oh, you can't pay up, I'm at least going to get something out of you. We're going to sell everything you have, and you and your family are going to be sold to slavery, so I at least recoup some of my loss. The man did what anybody would do, and he falls to his knees, imploring the king, saying, have patience with me. I will pay you everything. It's a ludicrous promise, and one he could not possibly have fulfilled. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant forgave the debt. But when the same servant went out, so this man who has been forgiven this enormous amount of debt, the king says, don't worry about it. I'll let you slide this time. He immediately goes out and he finds another servant who owes him 100 denarii. That's 100 days' pay. If you can imagine a third of your annual salary, that's a chunk of change. And this guy is late on paying up to the man who's just been forgiven. The man who's just had that enormous debt wiped away grabs this other servant who owes him 100 denarii, a significant debt, although less than the one he owed the king, and he does what Roman law allowed you to do. He grabbed him by the throat, and he twisted his neck, not till he passed out, but just until his nose began to bleed, and demanded payment. The man couldn't pay, and he says some words that should sound familiar. Please have patience with me, and I promise I'll pay you everything. But the king's servant, who had been forgiven so much, would not have pity on this other servant, and he had him thrown into debtor's prison, which is what happened to you back then if you couldn't pay your debt, and it was often a hopeless case for you to ever get out. The other people who were standing by and knew what had happened were horrendously upset, and they go to the king and tell him, and the king calls back in the man who owed him so much. He says to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt just because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother and sister from your heart. Wow. Jesus doesn't really let people off the hook with this not making it right with other people or holding on to things. Even in his presentation of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew that you read in, or the disciples' prayer, the model prayer, whatever you want to call that you read in the Sermon on the Mount, do you notice that he ends it with, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. For if we do not forgive our brothers and sisters, we can't expect forgiveness. We can't expect to get from God what we are not willing to give to another human being. Jesus is pretty hardcore on this idea of making it right with other people. And that's something that's unfortunately sometimes missing in modern presentations of faith, where it's like me and God forgave me, and that's really all that matters. If that doesn't move forward into fixing what is broken with other people in our lives, something is severely lacking in whatever change that we have. What God, I think, ultimately envisions, or at least what he presents here, is the idea that the forgiveness we get from God, we extend to others. The forgiveness we extend to others is but part of our process of being set free and released from whatever we owe to God for our moral transgression. The image of debt is the idea of having done something wrong to another. I owe them because I've trespassed against them. I owe them because of what I've done, and I can't pay up. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is the one who's willing to pay the account, but there is a strong expectation that we'll pay it forward to somebody else and offer somebody else the grace that God extends us. And he doesn't really leave any wiggle room for that. So understand, when you pray the Lord's Prayer, if you do that at your church like they do at my church every Sunday, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We are literally praying, forgive me to the same extent that I'm willing to forgive those who have done me wrong. And that's a huge idea in Matthew's gospel, that we fix what is broken between us and other people, because God is fixing what is broken between us and him.